Hello, dear viewers. Support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it. And also, make sure you comment your thoughts. Now let's start the video. Tell them what happened next, my lord, he said. And Howland began to speak. Aegon listened as the lord told of Summer's death, of Hodor's fall and the deaths of the children and the three-eyed raven, of how his brother had been marked and the magic that had once protected them was then able to be bypassed. Though he didn't speak on the wall, it mattered not, as Aegon had begun to believe that the Night King could only break through its magic because of what Bran had done. Magic? He heard Lord Royce snort. What are dragons, my lord? If not creatures of magic, dire wolves. You've seen my brother, and no doubt my sister spoke often of the things he supposedly can do. What answer do you have for that? He asked. But magic, your grace. Actual magic. Dragon existed, and I know of the dire wolves, and of wargs. I may not understand them, but these things are known to me. A magical barrier, a mark on an arm. Dead men come our way, my lord. Trust me, when you look into their blue eyes, you'll see that magic exists. But since you doubt it so, perhaps you can explain this, he said, undoing his tunic and nodding. He was not upset or reluctant to do so, as he looked to his wife. I was killed by my brothers, stabbed to death because I knew what came for us, and refused to let a people die. Who brought me back, I know not. Lady Melisandre claimed it was the Red God, but I've never knelt to him, only to mine own. Why I was brought back, I can only imagine, was to prepare for the fight to come. I was dead, Lord Royce, and yet now I live and breathe and find I much prefer it, he said, and was glad to hear some laughs as the tension was broken. Still think there is no such thing as magic, Kneeler? Tormund said, and Aegon saw the Lord of Roanstone shake his head. My brother and the Night King are linked. He wants him for reasons I know not, and so he'll come for him, and we'll be waiting for him when he does. How far this link extends, I know not, but I know my brother sees things. I fear that the Night King sees what he does when he does, and so we keep our true plan from him. From now on, we act as if all we say in front of him is known to the Night King, he said to Nods. He sent the others away and was left with Dany and Jaime Lannister, the knight having held back while the others had gone about their day. I owe you an apology, your grace, Jaime said, looking at him. Sieur, many years ago I made a poor jape at your expense. I thanked you for guarding us against what was beyond the wall. Jaime said, his expression one of deep regret. You spoke the truth, sir. Had I listened to you, then the world would have been a much different place, he said with a smile. Your grace, I'm sure it'll be thrilling to serve in such an elite force. And if not, it's only for life. Those were the words you spoke to me. True words, sir. You may have meant them in jest, but few men told me the truth of what I was doing, and I thank you for it. So no, you owe me no apology, he said, and Jaime nodded as he moved to go away before he stopped and looked at him. Had I known of you, the truth of you, had I known, I'd have never let you swear your life away. Never. Jaime said. Aegon gave the man his warmest smile as he watched him walk away and then turned to his wife, who'd stayed silent the whole time. She'd allowed him to hold the meeting and run it, and apart from speaking to her own men, she'd let him take the lead. When he told her what he planned to do, they'd argued, made up and argued again, but they were united now. One thought, one desire, one outcome they both sought. You think him loyal? She asked as he took her in his arms. More so today than yesterday. We'll see how he is tomorrow, he said, brushing her hair from her eyes. You really think he'll come for Bran? She asked softly. Aye, which will mean he'll come for you, she said worriedly. I'm counting on it, he said, looking deep into her eyes. Aegon, I will see our child born, see them grow, and be joined by brothers and sisters. I will grow old with my wife and find out if silver ever turns to gray, he said, holding a strand of her hair in his hands, as she smiled softly. You'll go gray long before me, she said, and he chuckled. We'll go gray together, he said, kissing her and holding her tightly. Winterfell 305 AC. Rhaegar Lannister. As he left the second meeting of the day and smiled as what the king had said seemed to have been confirmed by his brother's own words, Jaime looked to those he walked with, Brienne and Podrick, Lord Beric, Dolorous Ed, Galbart Glover, and Lord Reed, all of whom had been working with him to see to the defenses and who he'd grown close enough to over the last few days. I say we get seriously fucking drunk, Galbart said to a few laughs. Aye, seems as good a plan as any, Lord Reed said. Sir Jaime? Brienne asked, and he nodded. Let's hope we don't run out of ale. That really would be my luck. The night before facing an army of dead men ending up being the driest one of my pitiful life. Ed said in his own inimitable way, and yet Yamesye barely heard him. His mind was miles away. When he'd come here, he wasn't sure what to expect, or even what the reasons were. He had thought he'd be leading the Lannister army and fighting for the future of Westeros, and yet he should have expected she'd do what she'd done. Still, he came, and for the entire journey, he wasn't sure why or how he would be received once he got here, though he doubted it would be well. That part at least going somewhat how he'd imagined it would, and yet very much not as well. Brienne standing up for him had been a surprise, and he wondered then if it was her that he'd come for. Had he left his sister behind because he had feelings for someone else? Or had he come here because he felt he owed her something? He hadn't been able to tell which, if either was true, and had then thought that he'd come for his brother. Jaime, imagining that it was the thoughts of standing by his brother's side and of ensuring that Tyrion was safe, that had made him ride the length of the country and brought him to the biting cold of the north. But when Tyrion had lost his pin, when he'd complained about how he was treated and how he'd been wronged, Jaime had found himself sure that it wasn't his brother he'd come here for either. He'd listened as Tyrion had made the same complaints he'd always made, and he began to wonder just how valid they had ever been. While true his father had never given Tyrion his due, it was also because his father had always found his brother lacking, something the queen he served now did too, it seemed. So if it had not been Brienne or Tyrion, then what had been the driving force to bring him here? Why had he abandoned his sister and all he knew to go fight and more than likely die alone in the cold and or a people that hated him? He still wasn't sure, but what he did know was that he had not come here for Jon Snow or for Daenerys Targaryen. He'd not come expecting to find Rhaegar's son and then pledging to fight for him and his wife. He'd not come for redemption, or at least not in that way, and yet be it the gods or someone else's will, he may have just found it. "Sarkime," Brienne said, looking at him oddly. "Sorry, I find myself perhaps more in need of a drink than I thought," he said, covering up that he'd not been listening to them speak. They walked to one of the smaller halls, Yakime taking a seat by the fire and soon finding himself with a mug in his hand and his eyes looking into the flames. Memories flooded his mind of days long past, and each of them taking him further back than he'd ever imagined they would. He'd always thought that if he ever found himself standing on the precipice, and if he was ever faced with a fight that he may not win, then his thoughts would have been simple. Blonde hair and green eyes, the warmth of her body, and the sound of her moans. At the end, he'd always thought he'd think of her, and her alone. Instead, he saw silver hair and deep purple eyes, a dark-haired girl chasing after a black cat, a crying babe, and a mother lifting him from his crib. He saw Sarah Barristan, Sarah Jonathor, Prince Lewin Martell, and Sarah Oswell Wend. He saw Sarah Gerald, and then he saw the pale blonde hair and deep violet eyes of Sarah Arthur Dane. The sound of a harp and the clash of blades, and 6 shadows standing in front of him, and all of them looking him over. Ser Arthur moving forward, and Jaime swore he could hear his voice as clearly as if he was there in the room beside him. 7 we were once, and you were just as we, but now there is only you who remains. Do what we could not, be what we all once were, and should you fall, then fall only as a true knight. Ser Arthur said. The empty mug crashed to the ground, and Jaime heard the laughs and the japes in the room once more. He got up from his seat to pick it up and caught Brienne's eye. Smiling at her, he walked away to refill his mug, listening as the conversation turned and noticing for the first time that Tormund had joined them without him noticing. "You're not a knight?" Tormund asked. "Women can't be knights," Brienne replied. "Why not?" Tormund asked. "Tradition." "Fuck tradition," Tormund said, and Jaime smirked as he filled the mug. What words were spoken next? He heard not. His mind instead, he thought on what Ser Arthur's voice had said to him as he had looked into the flames. The message may have been for him, but the words spoke true of another too. It wasn't him who'd tried to keep his word to Lady Stark, nor he who'd traveled the realm searching for the girls. He didn't bring Sansa Stark safely to her brother at the wall, nor did he stand up for honor whenever he could. "Kneel, Lady Brienne," he said, and heard her try to laugh it off. "Any knight can make a knight, and there are few that I've ever known more worthy than you. Kneel a lady and rise a knight." He looked on as she nervously rose to her feet, her footsteps slow as she walked towards him, and when she reached him, he looked at her and nodded. Brienne finally going to one knee as he raised his sword and moved it to her shoulder. "In the name of the warrior, I charge you to be brave. In the name of the Father, I charge you to be just. In the name of the Mother, I charge you to defend the young and innocent. In the name of the Maiden, I charge you to protect all women." By the time he was done, there were tears in Brienne's eyes as she looked at him. Jaime, knowing that what he had just done was good and true. "Arise, Brienne of Tarth, a knight of the Seven Kingdoms," he said, and somewhere in the back of his head, he swore he could hear Cersei Arthur's voice speak again. "And now there are two," Arthur said. "The next 305 AC. Tyrion." Each mile he rode, he felt his anger rise, his grip on power faltering with each step the horse took. That he was tired, cold, and hungry was not helping his mood any, nor was the fact that Sansa Stark had left without him. Sure, she'd told him some of her plans, and Tyrion knew that she needed to do what she'd left to do. It didn't mean he enjoyed being left behind, though, especially not when he was starting to feel more like the outcast that he'd become. Looking at Davos wearing his pin and seeming to be as much in charge as Lord Wyman was only made his mood worse. Tyrion felt embarrassed that he was replaced by anyone, let alone the Onion Knight, a smuggler from Flea Bottom who could barely read was now wearing the pin that was rightfully his, and it angered and irked him, as did the fact that he'd been denied the chance to ride in Lord Wyman's sleigh. Instead, he'd been offered either a horse or a place in one of the carts beside the old and ill. It was a huge calm down from where he'd been, but a few moons earlier. He no longer even had any guards with him, whereas before, the Queen would always insist he was protected. The good thing about it was that it gave him time alone with his thoughts and allowed him to try and make some sort of a plan to right his world. The bad was that, so far, he'd found that there were very few options that actually did anything to change his own position. Revenge could be had, but he wanted much more than that. He wanted his pin back, he wanted favor back. He wanted his queen back, and that was a far more difficult proposition. When they stopped and he sat by the fire to eat his pitiful meal, his mind went in a million directions at once. Ideas coming and going, plots being discarded, and plans rejected, and each of them frustrating him more and more. As he slept, he dreamed of rising high once more, and yet, even in his dreams, no pathway to that rise was shown to him. Tyrion woke up in the morning only to repeat the previous day's activities and finding himself almost going around in circles. "Is that the White Knife?" he asked one of the Manderly men who rode by him on the way to the back of the line. "Aye," the man said, and Tyrion felt some relief knowing that they'd not be far from White Harbor, and that soon he'd be laying in a warm bed and perhaps could think more clearly. It turned out to be false hope, as rather than turn from the King's Road, they rode further south along it, past Castle Serwyn, and ever closer to the Neck, and he began to realize that they weren't heading to White Harbor at all. Upon reaching the moat, this became even clearer, and he felt his anger rise once more. He'd been lied to, played, and made a fool of once more. Who? The Queen, the Northmen, Sansa Stark. The names coming and going from his head, as he looked to Sir Davos Seaworth and Miss Missandei. And he saw they had known all along. No, this was Snow, this had to be Snow's plans, and for a brief moment, he began to panic. Did he know? Did he know that he planned to betray them, that he intended to see them suffer loss so that he could rise once more? He took a deep breath and relaxed. He didn't know, he couldn't, and if he did, then Tyrion would already be a head shorter. The Queen had only taken his pin, even as she'd warned him what could happen, but she'd not closed the door completely. And had Jon Snow known then, he knew that she would have. "Are you well?" he heard one of the Manderly men ask, and he nodded his head as he began to calm down. "I'm good, tired and confused, though, as I thought we were going to White Harbor." "Aye, me too," the man grumbled. "You weren't aware we were coming here?" he asked, and the man shook his head. "The Lord just kept telling us to march the King's Road. I thought we'd have pulled off at some point," the man said. "Are we marching further?" he asked. "Ah," the man said as he walked away. Further south could only mean they were heading deeper into the Neck itself, which brought him close to the Riverlands. Had he his own men with him, loyal men, then he could ride and find a keep where to put his plans into action, where he could have access to ravens or to men he could pay to do as he willed. With these Northmen, he'd not risk approaching them. Even were he able to buy their loyalty, the chances of being found out were far too great. No, he needed to bide his time, wait until the time was right, and then do what needed to be done. Cersei would welcome the information, and she and Greyjoy would act upon it. The losses would be severe, but would not break them. And Jon Snow and Ser Davos would face the brunt of the Queen's displeasure, not he. He needed to wait, and so wait he would, and when the time was right, he'd strike once more. He'd cost her allies already. What cared he if he cost her some more, and a husband in the process? Stormlands 305 AC. Edric Storm. He looked to Sir Andrew when they saw the shores of the Stormlands come into view for the first time in over 4 years. 4 years during which he'd gone from a scared young boy who'd found out he was to be burned alive by his uncle, to a strong young man who now led a decent force and was finally ready to take back his home. He'd grown bigger, stronger, Sir Andrew and Sir Tristan both telling him that he looked more and more like his father each day. Other than his clean-shaven face, that was, Edric finding that the warmth of Essos not conducive to the wearing of a beard, that and the one he'd tried to grow, was pitiful. "You ready for this?" Sir Andrew said, looking to him as he turned to walk away from the front of the ship. "I was born ready for this, cousin," he said, heading to his cabin to make ready to go ashore. Less than 2 hours later, the ships had docked, and his men were disembarking. Almost 4,000 in total. It had taken him time, coin, and many battles to bring these men to his side. The company of the Stag, Louis the Fishwife, had named them in jest, and though they held little to the name, the banner they flew did indeed carry a stag upon it, Edric doing his best to both show his father's sigil of the black stag while incorporating his mother's, and so he had it on a field of blue flowers rather than the yellow background of his father's house. As he disembarked, he saw the banners fly proudly, and he walked to the horse that his men held for him. "We're ready to ride, my lord," Sekarolgower said, and Edric quickly mounted his horse. "Any word from Lord Caspar?" Sir Andrew asked. "No, but the gates have been closed and his men mount the walls," Sir Tristan said. "We parley?" Edric asked, and Andrew nodded. He looked back on the ships, 50 in total, and he knew that soon most would be sailing back to Essos, their work done and their coin fairly earned. Edric and his men would not be joining them. One way or another, he had sworn he'd die in the lands of his father, be it today or, if he got his way, many years from now. "We ride," he shouted, and together with more than 1,000 mounted men, they began the short ride towards Rainhouse. Behind them, another 1,000 mounted men in their almost 2,000 foot, along with their 300 archers, would march more slowly. Edric was not expecting a fight here, but prepared for one all the same. And once they reached the outskirts of Lord Caspar's lands, he sent Sir Gerold and some men to bring his offer to the Lord of Rainhouse. By the time they reached the keep itself, Sir Gerold and his men were riding towards them with Lord Caspar and some of his retainers. Edric relieved to see the smiles on both men's faces. "Lord Edric, it is you. Thank the Seven." Sir Andrew, Sir Tristan. Lord Caspar said, looking to him and then to his knights. "Lord Caspar, it's good to see you once more," he said warmly, smiling at the older lord. "You too, Lord Edric." "It's just Edric, my lord," he said softly. "No, my lord, it's not," Caspar said, climbing down from his horse, Andrew looking to him and bidding him do likewise. As he did, he looked on as Lord Caspar bent to one knee, as he drew his sword out and held in his hands while the lord looked up to his face. "I renew my allegiance to House Baratheon, and to its lord and heir, Edric Storm," Lord Caspar said, and Edric looked to see the beaming smile that appeared on Sir Andrew's face, his cousin having spoken of this moment almost constantly since they'd been forced into exile. "And I vow that you shall always have a place by my hearth and meat at my table, and pledge to ask no service of you that might bring you into dishonor. I swear it by the old gods and the new. Arise, Lord Caspar." Once the lord did, Edric, Sir Andrew, Sir Gerold, and Sir Tristan were all asked to join him in Rainhouse as his guests, each of them accepting guest right when it was offered, and Edric welcomed the warm bath and the meal they were given that night. Though he found that while he'd missed the food of his homeland while away, now that he was here, it was Assasai fare that he found himself longing for. After eating their meal, he refused the drinks that were offered, surprising the lord until Sir Andrew explained that he'd sworn an oath to forego drink until his home was his once more. Edric, noticing the approving look that Lord Caspar gave him once he heard Andrew speak on this. "What is the state of the Stormlands, my lord?" he asked, as he drank his sweetened water. "We've been left to our own devices, Lord Edric, like a ship without a rudder. We've been drifting and waiting for someone to take charge," Lord Caspar said, looking to him. "Storm's End?" he asked. "In the hands of some Lannister lickspittle," Lord Caspar said, almost spitting as he spoke. "The rest of the Stormlords," Sir Andrew asked, "will rally to their lord's side." "What of the realm?" he asked. "Where to begin?" Lord Caspar sighed as he took a swallow of his wine, Edric sitting eagerly as he awaited the news. It took a long time to hear it all, and by the time he was done, Lord Caspar had drunk 3 more glasses of wine. Edric listening to each word he spoke with great interest and barely able to believe what he had heard. The tale had everything. War, destruction, a mad queen and a crazed pirate, dragons and a bastard king, and Edric had smiled a little hearing the last part. To hear that House Tyrell had been ended, House Tyrell all but, and that the mad queen had aligned with Euron Greyjoy and had blown up the Great Sept was beyond belief. Hearing about Daenerys Targaryen and her dragons was not, as Edric had spent over 4 years in Essos and tales of the Mother of Dragons were well known to him. As he stood in his rooms that night with ravens sent to the most loyal Stormlords and a plan to take his home back clear in his head, he thought of Daenerys Targaryen and wondered if she was as beautiful as they said she was. In truth, she was the reason he'd come back and why he'd needed to do so now. Sir Andrew had wished for him to go to her, to offer her his hand, and to then bring the Stormlands to her side. But as much as he loved his cousin, in this, he was very wrong. She'd not just blindly accept him. Given his name and his father, she may very well kill him unless he could offer her something that she had not. No, he'd take the Stormlands first, and then make her the offer of a marriage between her house and his own. Together they'd unite first. Their claims and then the realm, and together they could rule. He'd even settle for being a consort if she was truly as beautiful as they said. As he lay in his bed, he thought of Jon Snow, the king in the north, Lord Caspar had said. He'd lose his crown soon enough, of that he had no doubt. But he'd proved one thing, a bastard could also be a king, and soon the realm would have another, who wore a crown. Winterfell 3005 AC. Maggie. She sat with the men of Bear Island and with Lyra, all of them reminiscing about their home and how much they'd like to see it again. Maggie having not seen it in almost 7 years, and Jorah even longer than that. Each time she looked at her daughter, she saw glimpses of Daisy in the smallest of things that Lyanna did. How she looked around at all who were present, and how she was always watchful and wary of the looks she got in return. Maged had thought about sending her back to Bear Island, of asking her to take some men and leave. She'd even thought of asking her to go with the others as they traveled to the Neck. She knew, though, she could not, that not only would Lyra not listen, but she'd hate her for asking her to leave. But it worried her, having her here, seeing what she'd seen, and even speaking to Helen hadn't made that worry completely fade away. His words not as comforting as they should have been, and the images not leaving her mind. The gods brought us here for a reason. Miegtu, they made us wait for a reason. You heard their words, the promise they made. We have to have faith in them and in the king, Howland said as they knelt before the weirwood tree. I placed my faith in the gods before, in a king before, and it cost me my daughter. How am I to know this is any different? She said, looking to him. Jon Snow is a different king, and this is a different time. You saw our people fall Maekes, not march to safety. You saw Winterfell almost fall. And was it as ready as it is now? No, she said. No, Lyanna will live. The North will survive, and we will win, Howland said. Megget heard a cheer run around the room and turned to see Jon Snow walk in. The king without a crown, some had come to call him, and she chuckled at that. King Robb had worn his always, and while Wyman and others had offered to have one made for Jon Snow, he had refused. The crown didn't make the king, the man did. And there was no doubt that Jon Snow was a king to any who knew him. Both he and his queen had a presence about them, and though it was different with each of them, it was the same too. An air of something that she couldn't quite put her words to, but she's something that she knew to be true. Lady Mormont, Lady Lyanna, Sarajara, my wife wishes to speak to you. She's with Grey Worm, speaking to the Unsullied. Jon Snow said as he looked to her nephew, who nodded as he got up from his seat. May I, my lady? Of course, your grace, she said, as he took a seat, and she smiled as another round of ale was brought to their table. I wanted to speak to you both before the battle. I wish to thank you for all your house has done for me, he said with a warm look on his face, as he looked at Lyanna. House Mormont has always stood by House Stark. Your grace, Lyanna said, and she nodded her agreement and approval of her daughter's words. They have my lady. I'd not let any man dare say different. There has never been a more leal house than yours in any kingdom, not just the North, Jon Snow said. Megs looked to see the prideful look on Lyanna's face, feeling her own pride rise in her chest at the sincerity of the king's words. But I wish to thank you for myself, my lady, for me and not for my house. Your uncle, your brother, he said, looking to her. He was my Lord Commander, a guide and a mentor. He was a man I truly respected, and one who gave me this. He pointed to Longclaw, without which I'd have been dead long before I finally fell. You wear it well, your grace, she said, seeing Lyanna's nod. I never has a man held a truer blade, and I thank Aintier every day for gifting it to me. But Jer isn't the only Mormaint I am indebted to. You, Lady Lyanna, you more than any other northerner I owe a debt, and am thankful for. Were it not for you, I'd have given up on the march to Winterfell, and I would not be wearing a crown here today. You're not wearing a crown, your grace, Lyanna said, and Magus swore she'd never seen a man laugh as hard as Jon Snow did just then. Lyanna herself laughing fully, which was a rare thing. No, my lady, but were I then, I'd owe it greatly to you. I wished you to know that I was grateful for it, for everything you've done, and I wanted to thank you and to wish you well. I feel most fortunate to have known you, my lady, and I just wanted you both to know that, Jon Snow said as he rose to his feet, giving them both a slight bow as he walked away. Meiji looked to Lyanna and saw she was turned away from her, the movements of her hands telling her that she was wiping her eyes, and when she turned back to face her, Meiji saw the water pooling in her daughter's eyes. Soppy sod, her daughter said, and Mage chuckled as she moved closer to her, feeling her lean in against her as they sat quietly and alone, and she swore an oath that no one would harm her child, not gods, not men, not even a giant. Howland. He sat with Galbart and drank far more than he usually did, glad that Mira had heeded his words and traveled with the rest further south. His daughter's disappointment at what Bran Stark had become only having grown more into anger and sadness since they'd arrived. His own feelings towards the boy were anger only. His son had given his life for this thing that he'd become. Unfeeling, uncaring, and unwilling to offer any comfort, or worse, to offer any help. Howland had seen it for himself in their meeting. He'd heard the words spoken from the boy's mouth, and felt the lack of caring in each of them, simply stating that he was what the Night King was coming for, and that he would certainly come, and then he'd listened on as Jon Snow had made plans that would never take place. It had been clear to him that his king was right. They could not trust this thing Bran Stark now was, and so they had to hide their true intent from him. It had been clear, and yet it had hurt too, as he realized that his daughter had loved Bran Stark once, and that Bran Stark was truly gone. Looking around the room, he saw Jon Snow speaking with the Mormonts, and then he saw him walk his way. The king had been going from table to table and speaking with each of the Northmen that sat there almost one by one, offering words of encouragement, comfort, and helping them when their courage faltered. He showed them his own confidence in the outcome of the battle to come. Howland saw him pat some men on their shoulders, laugh with others, and speak softly to even more, and then he was standing at their table looking down on him and Galbart, asking permission to take a seat beside them. Of course, your grace. We'd be more than pleased to share a drink with you, he heard Galbart say. I thank you, Lord Glover, Lord Reed. Your grace. He didn't stay too long, just a couple of drinks before. Howland saw one of the Black Brothers walk from the Great Hall, Jon Snow, looking at the man as he did so, and then bidding them farewell. The words he'd shared with them both were words of victory, words of confidence. He told them that they'd see what needed was done. Then came words of the future and of what was to come, how the North would rebuild, grow strong, and rise once more. How he and the Queen would see it done, Howland finding them more comforting than any of the others. He, Jon Snow, Medade, Galbart, all of them were here, now to ensure that the North had a future. Their lives, their blood, were all to ensure that their people had a future, and with the gods' good graces, he would see it done. Adieu. She found him working in the forge still, his hammer beating down on steel and Arya looking at him as he worked. The others had either called it a night and gone to bed or were drinking in the Great Hall, a final night of peace and joy before the war to come. Gendry, though, had stayed to work and Arya had come to watch, or at least that's what she had thought she'd come for. Now that she was here, she wasn't sure what it was that she'd left the Hound and Barrack for. All she knew was that she didn't wish what could be her final night, to be one spent with men such as those. Men who'd killed and in Barrack's case had been killed. Earlier that night, she'd spent her time alone with Jon, her brother, telling her how much he loved her and asking her to promise that she'd not risk herself on the morrow. Roger agreeing, but only if he did likewise, and though both had spoken what the other had wished to hear, both of them knew their words were just that. She'd felt his arms go around her and had held him just as tightly, letting him wipe away her tears when they'd begun to fall. That his own had come was a surprise, and yet not, and her fingers had soon brushed them away. They'd spoken on the future, laughed about the past, and tried not to worry too much about the present. and in that at least they'd done a decent job. Neither of them had been able to say goodbye, and instead had simply said 2 words to each other. "Not today," she said softly as she remembered, though she'd not heard the hammer had stopped falling and was not aware that Gendry was looking her way. "Or Yaga," Gendry said, catching her by surprise. She looked at him with his face all dirty from the smoke and with sweat glistening on his arms, and before she could help herself, she was in his arms and kissing him deeply. "Roger," he said, when he moved his lips from hers. "Shut up, you stupid bull," she said, smiling as she kissed him again and again. Tormund. He'd tried and failed once more, the big woman making it clear that she was not to be stolen, and Tormund had looked jealously at the golden cunt when she'd done that Jaime Lannister had then left them alone. Gave him another chance, he had thought, and so he tried once more, only to find that he once again was denied. The big woman walking away with the young lad who followed her everywhere, it inevitably led him to drink, and he would have drunk some more, only he had someone else he wished to speak to before the night was done. So he made his way to the battlements and found Jon Snow standing speaking to one of the crows, the miserable one who never smiled. Tormund waited for his chance, and then saw the Dragon Queen was standing nearby, looking on, and so he quickly moved to her. "Dragon Queen," he said, smiling broadly at her. "Tormund, I had thought you'd have been drunk by now," she said with a smirk on her face, and he heard a chuckle come from behind him. "He is drunk. Just not fully drunk yet," Jon Snow said, and Tormund moved to him, grabbing him and lifting him from his feet. "I was waiting to see you, King Crow, before I drink my fill," he said with a loud laugh. "Aye, I wanted to see you too," Jon Snow said as he slapped his back. He looked on as the Dragon Queen gave them some room, and then he stood silently looking at his friend, the words he wished to speak not coming to his mouth, and the silence showing that Jon Snow knew not what to say either. "Thank you, Tormund," Jon said after a while. "I never thought I'd be friends with a crow, with a kneeler. Jon Snow, never thought I'd ever call such a man a brother," he said, reaching out his arm to find it quickly gripped by Jon Snow's own. "No man has ever had a truer friend, or a truer brother. Tormund, tomorrow we'll take our swords and shove them right up the Night King's arse. We'll look him in the eye and we'll say, 'We do not kneel.' Are you with me?" "Always, Jon Snow," he said, pulling him in and embracing his brother. After a few moments he turned to the Dragon Queen and did likewise before he turned and nodded to Jon Snow, and left them both alone, and he walked back down the keep. He hadn't got too far when he heard a voice call his name, and he turned to see the she-bear beckoning him to her room. The slap he got when he smiled at her, probably one he had deserved, and soon enough he heard the door close behind him. "I had thought you had no wish to," he said, as she began to undress. "This isn't the woods, Tormund. Here people would have talked," she said back, looking at him and motioning to his own clothes. "And now you don't care?" he asked as he began to take off his furs. "No, we may die on the morrow, so fuck them. But before you do that, come over here and fuck your bear," she said, and he moved toward the bed. "I missed you, Sheila," he said, as she grabbed a hold of his member. I missed you too, my bear in the woods." "Dany!" They'd decided to speak to their people separately, Dany leaving Aegon in the keep, while she and her guards headed to the Dothraki camp. Her men were doing what they did before a battle, almost. They were drinking but not fucking, the woman having left many days past. She'd spoken to them all and explained why they needed to go, and, though there were some who argued, more had accepted that the nature of this fight was unlike any they'd ever known. Their families weren't safe here. Should they lose, it wasn't another Khal or Khalasar who'd welcome them into their own. It was an army who'd see to their end no matter their age or sex. It had taken some time, but men had said goodbye to their women, their children, their old and ill, and all had left to go south. The fires still burned and the mare's milk was still drunk, but there was no true celebration, and she felt guilty because of it. They followed her and she denied them much. To deny them this too was something she wished she'd not have needed to do. "Kurlozi," the chant broke out, and Kuno stood up with the horn of mare's milk in his hands, holding it out for her to take. "Kui kuishi," she said loudly, as she took it from his hand and drank it down quickly. Again the cheers rang out, and she tilted the horn over to show it was empty, only making them cheer louder as she did so. Dany waiting until they quietened down before she spoke. "Kirikashi, tonight we drink and offer up our thanks to the great stallion for the victory he will bring us on the morrow. Once again, our Khalasar will ride and sweep those before us, just as we did in Meereen, just as we did in Westeros to the men in iron dresses. Tomorrow we will ride, and as you strike down our enemies from the ground, Drogon and I will strike them down from above. Kue kue, together we ride, and together we will deliver a victory that will be spoken of for thousands of years, she said, hearing the cheers ring out. Khaleesi, Khaleesi. She accepted when Quartermain gave her another horn, and she drank this one down too, touching his shoulder and nodding to him as she turned and headed back to the keep. Dany made her way to Grey Worm and the Unsullied and found them in a far different state than the Dothraki had been. They were relaxed but ready, and the speech she gave them was simple but true, asking them to fight and fight well, but to not throw away the lives that meant so much to her. You too, Torgo Mojo. You have a reason to live, and someone other than I who wishes to see you unharmed. Do not disappoint her or me, she said, seeing him nod as he looked at her. I for Miss Sandy of Nath, Grey Worm said, handing her a letter, and Dandy heard the footsteps behind her and turned to see Aegon walking her way. Miss Sandy is safe and well, Grey Worm. She and Ghost rest, and she prayed for you before she did so, Aegon said, reaching them and taking her hand in his own. You see this? Grey Worm asked. I see what Ghost sees, and she is safe and well. On that you have my word, Eklund said, D.A. seeing Grey Worm relax as much as he ever did. They then spoke some more, Aegon standing back while she spoke softly to a man who'd been forever loyal. Dany remembering her talk with Ser Jorah earlier and telling him just how much he meant to her, getting him to promise that he'd not throw his life away and would come back to her, just as he had already done. Her bear telling her that he would fight and fight well, and promising to be by her side when she took her place on the Iron Throne. Grey Worm was now doing the same, and Dany promised that, should the worst come to pass, that she'd see Miss Indi. Got his letter. She and Aegon then walked the battlements, Aegon saying he wished to speak to the Lord Commander before they took to their bed. Dany holding his hand and then letting it go as he and Aegon said their farewells and spoke of things she knew not. And a life before she'd arrived into his own, after Tormund had said his own farewells, Dany knew it was time. The two of them walking to their rooms, and neither of them speaking a word. The emotions of what they had said and done and what they would face on the morrow stealing their voices for now. Dainty wondered what she'd say, what they would say to each other, what words of comfort they could offer, and would they be enough. Aegon, seeming to feel exactly how she did, and almost searching for the right thing to say, and she felt herself tense up when he looked to her and took her in his arms, his eyes staring deep into her own. I love you, now and forever. That's all I know, and all I care about. I will wade through an army of dead men. I'll put each and every single one of them down them, the White Walkers, the Night King, all of them. Any who dare stand in my way to get to you, to be with you, any I swear it, Dany, to you, to our babe. I will burn them all. Aegon said, and she looked at him, saw the truth in his eyes. No, my love, we will burn them all, together, she said. Together, he said, kissing her, and lifting her up, and carrying her over to the bed. Winterfell 3005 AC. Aegon, their plans were made, and all they could do was wait. So after a night where he and Dany had almost exhausted themselves, Aegon woke and made his way to his mother's statue. He knelt in front of it and offered up prayers to any who'd listen. His mother, his father, the old gods, any his words simple and true. Me and not her. If it must be one of us, then let me fall, he said softly before rising. When he arrived back at his room, Dany was already dressing, his wife looking annoyed at him for not waking her up, though the kisses they shared soon seemed to win him back her favor. Together they walked to the great hall, finding it to be full and bidding people keep their seats while they took their own. The food they would all share today was more than they'd been eating for most of the days leading up to this. Not that they'd starved themselves or anything, more they'd conserved and not truly indulged. Aegon, though, had stopped for the night before and for today. What they had to face would require them to do so on full stomachs, and for some these would be the final meals they ate. They may as well enjoy them, he had decided. All is set, he heard Dany ask Grey Worm, who for once was sitting eating with them. All is set, my queen, we are ready, Grey Worm replied, and Aegon watched as Dany placed a hand on the man's shoulder and leaned in to whisper something in his ear. You're not drinking, King Crow, Tormund said, walking over with a horn of what he was glad to smell was ale. Neither are you, he said with a smirk, nodding to the horn. Drunk but not too drunk, King Crow, Tormund said with a loud laugh. The free folk, he asked, are ready for Hardhome, Tormund said, raising the horn. Aye, for Hardhome, he said, raising his own mug that was filled with water and slamming it against Tormund's own. He saw that Jaime Lannister was sitting beside and speaking to Brienne. Aegon smiling as he looked at them. Word had reached him of what had happened the night before, and he felt that she had deserved it more than most. Around the room he could see the northern lords and Lord Beric. He nodded to Ed and looked for Arya, though not finding her. It was a little later that he saw his little sister come into the hall with a very sheepish-looking Gendry beside her. Aegon was about to go over to speak to her since she'd not come to him, when one of the guards came running inside. "Riders, your grace, from the south." "Dead men?" Tormund asked. "No, they live," the guard replied, but Aegon had risen to his feet and was already heading to the door by then. Brienne and Arya followed behind him, as did the Mormonts and Lord Reed, with Dany and Grey Worm not too far behind. Aegon quickly headed to the battlements to see the riders from the best vantage point. He took the stairs 2 at a time and ignored the worried looks the guards gave him as he passed them. Soon reaching where he could look out and see the riders in the distance, 2 things became very clear to him almost right away. The riders were moving quickly and they were not part of the group he'd sent south. Aegon looking to see sigils he couldn't recognize and then turning to run back down to the courtyard and ride out to meet them. Dany and Arya met him first. His wife and sister had obviously run while the others had moved more slowly, and Aegon was happy to see both Jaime and Grey Worm close by his wife's side. "Who are they?" Dany asked. "I don't know, they're not ours," he said, and saw her look a little worried. "It's 50 or so men, Dany. If they mean us harm, they'll find themselves outmatched," he said, relaxing her some. They made their way to the courtyard, and despite his wishes to ride out, he took the advice of Jaime and the Northern Lords and allowed them to send out a party out in his stead. Waiting for the men to return was frustrating and yet welcome too, as it was the first time in Gods knew how long that he and others hadn't been thinking of the army of the dead and what marched their way. Eventually the riders and the party they'd sent out to meet them arrived at Winterfell's gates, and Aegon had a chance to get a closer look at the men. He could see they were tanned, not from the north, and perhaps from even further south than he had expected. Were it not for the sigils, he'd have named them as usse, but as he looked closer, he began to recognize some of them. A black adder, baiting a heel on a field of yellow, 3 black scorpions on red, and the one that excited him, and by the looks of it, Jaime Lannister him just as much, a white sword crossed with a falling star on a lilac field. "Halstein," he heard Jaime whisper. Aegon watched as 2 men dismounted before one moved forward and took a knee in front of him and Dante, though it was the blade on the man's back that took his and everyone else's eye. The young boy in him was keen to see if he was indeed right, and that was truly Dawn that the man carried. Looking to the other man, he found that he didn't like how he looked at him, and especially Dante, something about his eyes and his look feeling off to him. There was an arrogance about him, and the silver hair with its dark streak only added to it. The man on his knees seemed altogether more pleasant. He wore an easy smile on his young face, and his blonde hair and blue eyes were both quite striking. "Your Grace, I am Lord Edric Dane, and I bring greetings from Dorne," Edric said. "Arise, Lord Dane, and be welcomed." Aegon said, and the Lord did just as he was bid. Hearing a gasp from behind him, Aegon looked to see Arya moving forward with Gendry, both of them looking keenly at the boy who himself was looking past them at Lord Beric, wearing an even warmer smile on his face as he did so. "May I present my cousin, Earl Dane?" Edric said, motioning to the man with the silver streak who hadn't knelt and was now looking at Dany with even greater interest. "Your Grace," Sergeold said to her, and not to him. Aegon noticed. "You've come at a most inopportune time, Lord Dane, or perhaps it's actually a most opportune one. We make ready for a battle," he said, looking to see if the man knew more than he was letting on. "We heard against dead men, apparently." Sergeold snorted. "Aye, and they'll be here right soon," he said, not looking to the man but at his cousin instead. "We are here to offer our spears and swords should you have need of them, Your Grace," Edric said, and Aegon nodded before calling for Serjola and Lord Reed to see the men were properly armed, something which garnered an odd look from both Edric and Serjold. "We were just breaking our fast. I'm sure you'd welcome some warm food, and we can discuss what brings you to the north, my lord," he said, looking to Edric. "We'd welcome the warmth, Your Grace. The north's cold is not something we're used to," Edric said with yet another smile on his face. After they'd eaten and warmed up some, Aegon and Dany held a meeting alone with Lord Edric, where he told him to call him Ned, which raised his interest, and then gave them some background on himself. Aegon was most surprised to find that he'd been Lord Beric's squire, and had met both Arya and Gendry while with the Brotherhood without banners. Despite the urge to see Dawn in all its glory, He felt the need to inform him of exactly what was coming for them, and so began to tell the tale. Watching as Ned both looked disbelieving and worried at the same time, before he then began to listen more keenly. "I cannot deny this sounds most strange, your grace. Had I not seen what Thoros was able to do myself, then I'd call you a liar and a fool, though I do both in my head and not with my words," Ned said, and Aegon found himself chuckling. "I wish I was both, Ned. Truly. And when you see them for yourself, you'll wish it too. But they're coming and will be here by nightfall or early on tomorrow. So you won't need to wait for long to see me proved false or true," he said, looking to the man. "As I said, your grace, we're here to offer our assistance. If you can use us, then we're more than happy to help." "Why?" Dany asked. "Your grace?" Ned asked, confused. "Why come all this way? And why fight in a fight that's not your own?" she said, staring intently at Ned Dane. "On the second it would seem we have no choice, your grace. The fight is coming. Better to die with a sword in your hand than an arrow in you back. Not that I have any intention of dying here today," Ned replied with that same easy smile still on his face. "As for the first one, the princess would seek an alliance, your grace. She would see Dorne be part of the Seven Kingdoms once more, under your rule." Aegon looked to Dany, who he saw, despite how calm and composed she looked, was more than happy with this turn of events, her eyes sparkling with the knowledge that Dorne still saw her as the rightful queen. "And will Dorne offer up its spears to see my wife crowned?" he asked, catching the surprised look that Ned shot him. "It will, your grace, as long as Sir Lannister is brought down and faces judgment for her crimes, she and the Ironborn she's aligned with, then Dorne is more than happy to call her grace our queen." "And my husband? Will Dorne call him its king?" Dany asked curiously. Aegon looked on as Ned hesitated, something on his mind that he wished to say, but he held his tongue on whatever it was for now and instead seemed reluctant to answer. "A question for tomorrow, my love. Let's ensure first that we make it through today," he said, seeing the relief on Ned's face. The Battle of Winterfell, 3005 AC. Jaime, he wished he could be by his king's side or by his queen's, but he knew he could not. Yaxley's job was to make sure the keep didn't fall, and that's what he would do. Besides, he had no urge to fly on a dragon and out into whatever it was that Aegon and Daenerys were flying out into. So instead he stood looking out and waiting as the lights started to fade and night began to fall. A little earlier Melisandre had arrived and Jaime had watched as Aegon and his sister had both given the woman looks that did not bode well for her future. Only for her to say that she'd come to help, and then for her to be taken to the Dothraki at her insistence. Looking out on the darkness, he began to wonder if they were truly out there. If the army that everyone said was coming was on its way. Aegon seemed certain they were, and had sent the Dothraki and the Knights of the Vale to make ready. Beneath them, standing in front of the walls and behind the last of their barriers, the Unsullied, the Free Folk, and the Mountain clans stood waiting to invite them onto them, Jaime hoping that they would hold and move as the king had told them to do. There was more than a mile between the walls of Winterfell and the trees that were off in the distance, and for the last few days he'd made sure that as much of that mile as possible was filled with traps. Trenches were filled with spikes tipped with dragon glass, with oil that could be alighted. Caltraps had been made crudely to slow and perhaps stop some of the dead from reaching them. Every single trick, every tactic he'd ever read about to deal with cavalry charges, infantry marches, or holding a defensive position he'd used and adapted. All he could do now was hope he'd done enough. "Sirrah Shirmay," he heard Brienne say as she walked his way, Podrick walking beside her. "Sir Brienne," he said, with a nod, and saw the brief smile she gave and the much larger one on Podrick's face. "I'd rather be out there," she said as she took a place beside him. "No, you wouldn't. They have their job to do, and we ours. I'd not swap with them," he said, truthfully. "You really think they'll come, Sir Jaime?" Podrick asked, nervously. "The king does," he said simply in response. "Corno." Behind him were almost 50,000 of his very best men across the field in the distance, and led by Joao were the remaining 50,000. When the signal came, they would do as they'd been ordered by Calver Calso, having listened and accepted that his plan was far better than his own. His Calso had chosen a strong man to be her Khal, and he was a man that Calso felt comfortable calling his Khal. He'd proved his strength to him and to others in the things these people called spars, Khalzar showing his blade to be far truer than his own, and to any who dared challenge him. He'd also shown that his loyalty was to the Khaleesi above all others, even going against his own blood to do so, which was as it should be. Kalinver was Kohi to the Khaleesi, which made him Kohi to him too, and so he had listened and accepted his words. They'd keep their arcs, but would ride out with long spears called lances, and they would ride hard and true. Cut down and move on. Do not stop, ride, and only when you're through and out the other side are you turn to ride again. Kovray said, "This is not the Dothraki way," Cornel replied. "Against this enemy, this is the only way. Remember the 3,000... Cornel. I remember Koval. It was a strange feeling to have a cause and a Khaleesi, who, though they wished victory, didn't wish it above all else. Jon found that it was something that had taken him time to get used to, and even more time to understand. Yura the Andal finally making it clear to him when he brought the Red Witch their way, telling them that she was here to help and would do so once the time was right. "Why we need her help, Yura the Andal? You've seen what comes for us, Kono. Imagine what an army of them will look like. What men who are not men and who have no fear will do. Imagine that and tell me you need or accept no help. This woman may not follow the great stallion, but perhaps she serves him too." The Khaleesi. They wish this, he asked. "They do. Our Khaleesi would see you on the morrow. You and all her Kotikauchu," Jura said. "Not all will return from the ride this night, Jura the Andal. Not even the great stallion could make it so," he said, shaking his head. "Yet the Khaleesi would see that it was more than less. We have more battles to fight, more days to see, and more moons to live, my friend. All who fall, all who are lost, bring pain to the Khaleesi's heart. She would see her Koi live to ride another day," Jura said, gripping his arm before he rode off. Connell looked to the men behind him, and then he looked to the sky. He'd bring as many back as he could, and together they'd ride once more. Durien. They'd gone over their plans, again and again, Dainty not agreeing and yet knowing that she'd not change Aegon's mind on this. She wished to be a part of it, his plan for the Night King, and yet the words he spoke, though hurtful, were true. No longer was she alone, or was her own life the only thing she held in her hands. The life that grew inside her and that she was feeling more and more each day mattered even more than the life she feared for. "Our babe Dany, you and our babe, no matter what else happens this night. No matter how much it may pain you, I need you to promise me something." "Aegon," she said, shaking her head. "Promise me," he said, determinedly. "What would you ask of me? If all is lost, then you fly, you go, Dany. You, Drogon, our babe, you fly as far from here as you can. You live, both of you. Aegon, no. Promise me," Aegon said, determinedly. She had promised and had sworn she'd do as he bid, and yet she was sure she would not. She could not leave him or her people. She would not. They would win or they would lose. But it would be together, and as she climbed up on Drogon's back, she quickly made her own promise. Across from her, but too far away for her to touch or feel. She could see he was up on Raquel's back already. His passenger was secured in front of him, and he too waited to take to the air. They'd agreed that Dainty would see to the forces that attacked them. She'd sweep over the dead, and Drogon would lay down his flames, just as he had done so many times already. Aegon would take Redye and fly off and into the storm. His own target was sure to come his way, or so he'd told her. Dainty knew he was right, and cursed him for risking himself so. She felt Drogon begin to stir beneath her, and then she looked over to EJ and saw he was looking her way. Dainty trying to picture his expression as she watched Redye and take to the sky. "Solvagon, Drogon," she said, as Drogon followed his brother into the air. She heard the cheers of those below her as Drogon flew low enough for them to see. Dany looking down and seeing the battle had already begun. Beneath her, she could see dead men pushing against the barriers, the Unsullied pushing them back along with the Free Folk and the men of the North, and Dany flew as close to her own men as she dared before Drogon readied to lay the dead to waste. "Dracarys," she said, passing over a large group and seeing them burn, her eyes both on those below and the dragon which now flew further and further away from her. "Tormund." They came, and he almost shat himself to see just how many there were. It was different than Hardhome, or even being beyond the wall with Jon Snow. Here they were more focused on what was in front of them, the carnage he'd seen them bring to his people seeming far less organized than this. His axe swung as hard as it ever had, the head coming loose as he used his other hand to drive the dagger into another of the dead fuckers. Arrows flew from high above them, thinning the line they faced, but only briefly. Tormund hearing the screams as men were pulled over the barrier and into the army of the dead. Beside him, men fell, and the torchbearers soon moved to set them ablaze. Their lines both holding steady, and yet more and more flames were being lit where the dead men fell. Better that than they rise again. Tormund thought as he moved to take his axe to a dead man who had tried to take the wolf's head. The large lord of the mountains giving him a thankful nod as he went right back to ending even more of the dead fuckers in front of him. The free folk and the Northmen fought with a ferocity that was very much different than how the Unsullied were fighting. Tormund seeing the cockless men move their spears and use their shields to hold the dead men back. Swift and sharp, the spears moved out and then in, their dragonglass tips ending dead man after dead man. When he saw the bodies begin to pile up, he moved quickly, shouting to the wall, the Nori, and the middle little to help him out. The pile, we need to knock it over, he shouted, and then was forced to do so again when his words went unheard. Lead the way, Giantsbane, Big Bucket shouted as finally they moved towards him. They had to fight to get there, his axe never staying still as he found out that turning sidewards to the dead was a terrible idea. He felt dead fingers try to claw out his eyes, his hair being pulled, and he was grabbed only for the middle little to take the dead fuck's arms with his own even larger axe. Soon enough, they reached the pile and Tormund was relieved. They made it in time, all of them moving up against it and some more of their men joining them as they began to push. Whether it was the sheer mass of dead men behind it forcing it their way, or whether they somehow knew his intent, he couldn't be sure. But Tormund felt the pile being pushed back towards them. More, we need more, he shouted. It was his people that answered, Tormund looking on as they were led towards him, and soon enough there were more of them pushing than those who were pushing back. Torches, he called out loudly. The men ran with them as the pile began to move and was on the verge of falling over. He grabbed one from one of the men and pushed it into the bodies, watching as the flames took hold and as the other torchbearers did the same. The pile now aflame and crashing down on those behind it, and Tormund heard the cheers as more of the dead soon began to catch on fire. Looking out, he saw the black and red dragon as it laid down more and more flames on the dead that had tried to come their way. Show off, he said as he began to swing his axe once more. Luther Boggs. Why the fuck had he agreed to this? Was he mad? Did he have a death wish? Was he so keen to die that he was willing to lie in a field that was soon to be full of dead men? He wasn't sure that he hadn't lost his mind, and then it hit him. Luther wasn't here for himself, nor did he wish for glory. He was here for her, for them, for his wife and their children, and they were all that mattered. Not him, not the men with him, though he'd fight for them too. Lorna, Marl, and Hal, that was who he was fighting for. And whether he got to see them again or not, he'd give them the best chance to live that he could. Together with the other dozen men, he laid in wait. The cold ground having stopped bothering him some time ago. Time stretching on and feeling endless had long ago become something he was used to. The smell that had started to come his way was very much not. Not that he wasn't used to bad smells. Living in the neck near the swamps, he and every other Crannog man had smelt their share. This was very much different, though. A smell of death that filled up his senses so completely that he could smell nothing else. He saw them then for the first time, and he was glad he'd taken a piss and a shit before he'd covered himself in the grass and moss that lay over his back. Had he not, then he'd have been sure to have done both now as he looked out at the countless dead men that were moving his way. Some fell into the trenches, the spikes soon enough being so full of them that the dead were just able to walk right over the many bodies that were impaled. Others fell into the oil, and Luther heard the splashes and knew that the others amongst his men would soon set them alight. His first sight of a White Walker did loosen his bladder a little, Luther feeling a warm sensation run down his leg and both welcoming the heat it provided and wondering where the liquid came from. Was there always this little extra there, this small bit of piss that you could never relieve yourself off? If so, then why? Well, it was a question for another time and a conversation with friends that he looked forward to having. Taking his bow, he readied the arrow and waited until the White Walker passed him by. Moving as quickly as he could, he rose to his knees and readied his aim. The White Walker no more than 20 feet in front of him and a target far bigger than the squirrels he'd hunted back in the swamp. Yet, his fingers had never shaken when aiming at a squirrel, his hands had never sweated, nor had his mouth ever been this dry. So when he took his aim and missed hitting a dead man, Luther wasn't truly surprised. "Fuck," he said loudly. There was no need to hide his presence now, as the dead moved towards him and the White Walker looked his way. As quickly as he could, he loaded another arrow and readied to take his shot. Images soon flooding his mind of Lorna and of their wedding night, of holding Marl in his arms and seeing his daughters smile for the first time, and of welcoming Howl into the world and realizing that he was now father to a son. His eyes narrowed and he pulled the string back and watched as the arrow flew true. Then he closed them once more and readied for the dead to do their worst. The high-pitched scream had him dropping his bow and placing his hands on his ears, the sound like nothing he'd ever heard before. It was piercing, and it forced him to the ground before suddenly it was gone, and the sound was heard no more. How long he lay there for, he couldn't be certain. It felt like hours, but was perhaps not even a moment that he did so. Luther finally opening his eyes to see bodies around him and a pile of ice where the White Walker had once stood. He grabbed his bow and moved back into his hole, covering himself up with the grass as he lay in wait once more. Aegon! He laid down flames as he flew, hitting those furthest away from where the Dothraki would ride, and flying further north toward the storm. In front of him, Bran was strapped in, his brother a reluctant passenger, but a passenger all the same. Aegon had not listened to his arguments and had not given in to his own stupid plan, though there was no Theon to protect him until Arya could come and save him this time anyway. No, the Night King wanted Bran, and so Aegon would bring him to him, or more assuredly force him to come his way. The storm had already changed direction as soon as he had begun to fly, which proved him right on this. Looking behind him, he could see Drogon as he lay down his flames, and he wondered if Dany had given the Dothraki their signal yet. He doubted it, as there were still too many of the dead moving to make their way to the field, and so now was not the right time for the horse lords to ride them down. "We need to go back," Bran shouted into the wind, and Aegon just shook his head. Back was the last place they were needed. No, it was to the storm that he now flew. The dead men beneath him were long gone from his view, and the flames behind him seemed to be no more than a candle in the dark. He closed his eyes and checked on Rhaegal beneath him. Soon he was feeling the dragon's own sense of worry and doubt, and he smiled when he felt it was for him, rather than for himself. The dragon feared, Yodra Dadra Sagan Zugagan Emi Nayani Yedri Henkiri Nayat Mazigan Yuharakiras. "Don't be afraid, we have many years together to come, my friend," he said softly, knowing that his brother would not understand the words he spoke. He saw it then, the open expanse, the large drifts of snow, the north in all its harsh beauty, and he felt it call to him. The old gods were here, and they'd be watching, so he began to fly in circles rather than in any direction in particular. His eyes looked to the storm as it drew ever closer, and the battle he was born to fight was finally set to begin. Aegon reached down and felt the hilt of Longclaw. He moved his hand and felt the dragonglass dagger, and on his back he felt the bow and quiver. "We should not be here," Bran shouted, his voice far more panicked than it had ever been since he'd returned. "Yet here we are, brother, and here we'll stand or fall. Winterfell is safe as long as he comes to me," he said as he felt the winds pick up and the ice and hail began to hit against his face. Very soon he could see nothing, the whiteness of the falling snow and hail and the wind that whipped it up blinding him to all but a few feet in front of him, and he swore he heard a voice in his head that sounded like a woman calling out to him. "You are a dragon. Aegon, be a dragon. A true dragon," the woman's voice cried out. Aegon closing his eyes as he listened and saw what it was he was meant to see. His eyes no longer just his own, as he and Reborn became one. He felt the fire begin to burn within him, and then he felt the cold come ever closer and knew it was almost time. "Savagan Rhaegal, Savagan Adere Sadraitye. Fly Rhaegal, fly fast and true." The words were felt and not spoken, and Rhaegal flew just as Viserion dropped down from above, the cold ice of the dead dragon's flames missing them as they flew away, and soon enough they were being chased. Aegon, feeling the malice and hate from both the Night King behind him and the thing he called a brother that sat to his front. He held on as Rhaegal dropped low and skimmed the trees, the ice flames hitting where they had just been moments before. The chase was now on, and he wondered if the Night King was even aware that it was he who was the rabbit. Aegon smiling as he took off his bow. Grey Worm. They could not hold, he knew it, and the king and queen had known it long before the battle had begun. That he'd been ordered not to was the only saving grace he had here. as otherwise he and his men would fight to the last. As it was, it allowed for them to do as much damage as they could, and though some of his men had fallen, it was nowhere near as bad as it could be. The Northmen and the men from beyond the wall, the free folk, had helped them out greatly here as well, their ferocity matching the dead men who came their way. As for the Unsullied, they were precise and poised even in the face of an enemy that none of them who lived through this, should they be so lucky enough to do so, would ever forget. Grey Worm had thought seeing one of them in the dragon pit had been a sight that would never leave him. Seeing countless numbers of them as they attacked made the others seem like something that was easy to forget. He heard a cheer and looked on to see a large group of the dead fall, and an explosion of ice off somewhere in the distance was soon taking down another even larger group. The leader's Grey Worm. They're fast, faster even than I. One man may not take them down, but 2, 3, 4 or more. Men with arrows would be even better than men with swords and spears. When they fall, the dead will fall with them. Larger groups than any but the dragons can take down. The king's words were proved true, and he began to look to see if he could see any, his spear moving all the time as the dead kept coming his way. While he didn't find any of the so-called White Walkers, his eyes did soon come upon a much more happy sight. His queen and Drogon were proving that they were both mightier than even these dead men. Flame upon flame, arc upon arc. The dragon never stopped, and on its back his queen looked like the warrior she was. Daenerys may not swing a sword or carry a spear, and she didn't fight as the northern women did, but on her dragon's back she had ended more dead men than the entirety of the men that were lined up alongside him. "The Dragon Queen," he heard someone shout, and looked to see it was the red-headed large man who was close to his king. Grey Worm looked up to see as the queen and Drogon came flying their way. The sound the dragon made was as loud as he'd ever heard, the roar sending a vibration that he was sure every single man felt, one he was even more sure that every single man knew the meaning of. Looking back to the sky, he saw the dragon head to the east, and then he knew it was time. "Dova Jd Arli Nyotse Galmagon. Unsullied back to the keep," he said as his men began to retreat. They fought all the way, the spears moving even more quickly, the men of the north helping them as best they could, and as they reached the gates of Winterfell, he heard the sound of the horses' hoofs. It saddened him that they had lost more men in the retreat than they did in the fight itself, but he knew they had no other choice. They were tiring, and despite holding the dead men back, and the queen using Drogon how she was, it would have only been a matter of time until they fell. Now they had a chance, and soon enough he saw the gates as they closed, and he felt able to breathe and relax, even if it was to be for a moment. Dany. He'd rested for days, Dany making sure he was fed and fed well, and that he had no need to hunt, and Drogon, for once, allowing her decision to stand. Her son was willful and uncooperative when he wished to be, and yet he could be anything but when he knew she was right. Dany, knowing that he wished for nothing more than to fly to Rogol and to bring the fight to the thing that had taken Viserion from them both. That it was what she wished to do more than anything else, only made her even more grateful that Drogon had listened to her when she'd explained why they could not. If her son had decided he'd not, then she'd have given in by now. As it was, he'd instead done as he was bid. The reasons for her being here had quickly become very clear. The dead just kept coming, and they would have been overrun by had they not had a dragon to offer them protection. Drogon's rest had allowed that protection to run for far longer than she'd expected. His flames had kept falling, and her son had shown no signs of letting up. After taking as many passes as she dared and seeing that the army of the dead finally seemed to be thinning and that those guarding the barriers looked to be tiring, she'd felt it was time, so she'd flown over them and gave them the signal to retreat, and now she flew towards the Dothraki and the Knights of the Vale. Her eyes looked north instead of east, though, her mind with Yergon and Rhaegal as much as it was with any of the men on the ground below. Dany not seeing the storm anywhere in sight, and while that was good for those in Winterfell, she worried that it meant bad things for Aegon and her son. Flying over the trees, Drogon let loose his flame, Dany turning around as she heard the horses begin to ride. To the west, she flew next, and as she did so, she looked to the keep. The barriers were now covered in the dead as they swarmed, and she hoped that Grey Worm and the others had made it inside. As they flew over the battlefield, she felt Drogon's desire, and so she allowed his flames to cover the dead once more. How many she and he had burned this night was unknown to her, but it had to have been in the tens of thousands, she believed. Soon enough, they were over the other forest, and Dany gave the men below the same signal, and then she felt it as Drogon began to tire. Tegun, Drogon, land Drogon. They sat down in a wide open space. Dany keen to be able to see any danger which came her way, and she looked out to see the Dothraki were already in full flight. Dany looked to their swords and was surprised to see they were alike. Reaching into the small pack behind her back, she grabbed the bread and cheese from it, and then ate it hungrily. Once done, she swallowed down the water, and she tried not to smile as she remembered Aegon packing it for her before they had left to mount the dragons earlier that night. "What's that for?" "You," Axon said. "But I'm not hungry," she said, confused. "You will be my love. You're eating for two, remember." She felt Drogon's eagerness to get back to the sky and wondered, had her son actually been tired, or had he known how much she'd needed the rest? Did he feel her hunger, her thirst? Could he know that she'd needed to eat? That her babe needed food? Dragons knew things. She more than any was certain of that, and so she began to think that he did, and for some reason that made her feel even better. "Adarialan, Lemadan, Toli Zaldritz, Sos Yuha Tressi. Soon we'll have more little dragons, my son," she said, and felt Drogon's trill as they took to the air once more. "Lord Yar Royce." Seeing the dragon's flames, he lowered his lance and almost dropped it when suddenly the tip was ablaze. Jon looking around to see that the rest of his knights and the Dothraki that surrounded them were all now bearing flaming lances, giving that fire killed the dead, or so he'd been told. He supposed that this was a good thing, and so he reached for his horn and blew it as the knights and the Dothraki began to charge. Had anyone told him that at some point in his life he'd be doing this, then he'd have laughed and called them a liar to their faces. The mere idea that he'd be riding with, and not against Dothraki screamers, was one that he'd not have ever dared contemplate, but war often made for strange alliances, and this one more than most. Dothraki, Unsullied, Northmen, Wildings, all of them united against a common foe, the dead. Yozen was not a foolish man, and he didn't believe in the tales he'd heard and read about, unless he saw the evidence for himself, something that he had not seen here. However, he did believe in men, and men, despite their differences, all had one thing in common, one way of knowing when they spoke the truth. A man who feared for the life of those he loved and was willing to let them leave while he fought, that was a man you could believe in. That man would speak true, and be he Wilding, Northman, or Essu. Like the Dothraki, that was a man worthy to fight alongside. He'd spoken to them, to Jon Snow, and to Edison Tollet, and heard tales of dead men. Jon Snow telling him that before he'd left to go to the Wall, Ned Stark had executed a man that he'd since found out was part of the group that Waymar had ridden out to range with. That man had spoken of the dead, and had they believed him then, had they listened then, they may have saved the realm from the chaos it had found itself in. Jon had barely listened to that, though, and instead his nights since he'd been told had been filled with images of Waymar being turned into one of these whites that everyone spoke of. Jon's mind filled with images of White Walkers who apparently made the whites themselves. As he rode hard, as his lance was lowered, and as he finally saw the dead and realized that what he'd been told was right, that they had spoken true, he knew what he needed to do. For Waymar, he shouted as loudly as he could, his lance connecting with and setting a dead man alight. He cut down he knew not how many before the lance fell to the ground. Yak quickly grabbing the morning star from behind his back in its stead. The dragon glass had been melted into the steel, and the jagged edges that stuck out from it made it look even more deadly. Jan soon swinging it hard with all of his might as he rode through a never-ending field of dead men. When he was grabbed, he knew he was done for. The impact of the fall knocking the wind out of him, and it took him some time to rise to his feet, and he almost cried at what he saw. How many of the knights who had ridden out with him had made it through was unclear, but many had fallen, as had some Dothraki, though they seemed to have suffered fewer losses than his men had, and he wondered why that was. As he looked, he saw it clear. The Dothraki had ridden through while more and more of his knights had stopped to fight. It shamed him to see it so, the Knights of the Vale losing their discipline and forgetting the plan, while the savages from the east had not. However, seeing the dead move his way, he knew that he had far bigger problems than shame. When they parted after he'd taken down almost a dozen, Jan looked around confused and wondered why they had stopped coming his way. He saw it then, the creature made of ice, the White Walker, and he wondered if it had been the one. Was this the one that he saw in his dreams? The one who had killed his son? It mattered not, he thought, as he moved towards it. This one would do. the morning star ready in his hand as he looked on and saw as the creature almost seemed to form a blade of ice where before there had been nothing. It was fast, far faster than he, and he felt it was toying with him too, simply dodging out of the way of his strikes, and not truly aiming any of its own. When he finally did manage to catch its blade, he expected the ice to fall to the ground, only to look on instead in horror as the shaft of his morning star turned to ice and broke. He felt the coldness as the icy blade pierced his armor just under the arm, and he dropped to his knee. The White Walker soon moving in for the kill, and Jan looked on as the ice blade was raised, the strike ready to take his head. Where he got the strength he could not tell, but he brought the dagger up as the blade began to fall, hearing the shattering of the ice when the dragonglass dagger hit home. Around him, dead men fell as one, and Jan fell back onto the ground, the coldness flowing through him now and his breathing growing shallow as he lay back and looked up to the sky. He smiled when he saw the dragon lay down its flames, and as he heard the horses ride once more, the sounds of steel hitting dead flesh ringing out. "Usile, Endar, I go to see your brothers and your mother," he said as his eyes closed for the last time. Howland, loose. Reload, loose. How long and how many times he'd called it out he couldn't be sure, only that his voice was getting hoarse and they were running out of arrows. Wherever these White Walkers where they'd learned their lesson, be it his men who hid out amongst the dead, the one or two on the walls who'd found and hit their targets, or those who'd actually beat them in fights, they'd learned they could fall and so were nowhere to be seen. It meant it was dead men they were firing at, burning arrows being used rather than dragonglass ones, and soon enough they'd be using their swords and daggers. Mages, Ser Jorah, and Gebert all fought to keep dead men off the walls, while behind them Northmen led by Lord Beric and Arya Stark fought against those who'd managed to make it to them. Loose, reload, loose. He cried out the instructions for the final time, and then gave the order for his men to retreat. Against these things, his men were no use in a straight-up fight. Their poisoned darts and spear tips, or their tridents, gave them no advantage here. And without their arrows, all they'd be is meat for the Night King's army. Howland looked on as his men were replaced by men of Dorne, the young Dane lad leading them, and his thoughts soon going to the boy's uncle. Seeing Dawn again after all these years only fully showed him the failure he had been guilty of. The blade then cut deep into his side, and he turned to look at the dead man beside him. Stabbing it with the dagger he'd pulled from his hip, Howland fell to the ground and tried not to laugh at the irony. Even more so when Ned Dane stood over him with the white blade of dawn shining just as brightly as it did on that day many years ago. "How bad is it, my lord?" Ned Dane asked. Howland looked into his eyes and saw a much different man. A man he'd killed and who he knew he shouldn't have. He felt the blood at his side begin to pool, the knife having reopened the same wound he suffered at the hands of Sir Arthur all those years ago, Howland now believing that the gods had always meant for it to be his end. "Tell my king, I'm sorry. I should have come sooner. Tell him. Promise me." "I promise," Ned Dane said, and Howland felt the light begin to go from his eyes. "Janesine," he said softly, as he breathed his last. "Maegid." She saw him fall, and then heard the gate being pounded, and looked down to the courtyard to see Lyanna standing down there, giving men orders. Galbart was fighting men to one side of her and ahead of her. Jaime Lannister and Brienne of Tarth were fighting side by side. Maciek surprised to see the Lannister do so well with his offhand, though maybe some of that could be down to the Valyrian steel he bore. As much as she knew they were needed up here, and as much as she wished she had time to grieve for Howland, the crashing of the gate took all her thoughts away from all but that. "You're, with me," she shouted, and saw her nephew nod as the two of them ran down the stairs. Maegid shouted to men to go to the walls while she herself abandoned them. Reaching Lyanna, she stood beside her daughter and held her mace up. Jorah soon joining them, bearing a Valyrian steel tail, one she had no idea where he'd gotten. As the gate began to fall, she turned to her nephew and then to her daughter. "You stay behind me," she said to Lyanna. "Here we stand," she said to Jorah. "Here we stand," he shouted back to her. Seeing a giant in the flesh was far different than seeing one in a vision or even in the nightmares you had. Because of that vision, Megara heard Lyanna gasp, and Jorah take a deep breath as they watched the giant step on men and casually brush others aside. She moved quickly, Jorah following her, and Lyanna refusing to stay behind. Meager is both as proud as she had ever been and fearful too as she swung the mace at the dead man in front of her. Lyanna did the same as she, while Jared moved far better than she had ever known. He could, the three of them cutting down any who came near. "Sheila!" she heard a shout ring out, and soon enough there were 4, all of them working together, and none coming close enough to cause them harm. We need to kill that," she said, pointing to the giant that was causing havoc just feet ahead of them. "Giantsbane Tormund," shouted out, and she laughed despite the ridiculousness of his name. She moved out of the way of a giant hand as it crashed to the ground, saw Tormund pick and carry Lyanna when another swing had barely missed her daughter. Jerna getting ever closer to the giant's legs in front of her, and moving away when the giant tried to kick out at him. Rolling on the ground, she was only yards away when she was faced with a group of dead men, Lyanna breaking free from Tormund's arms to run her way. Time seemed to slow, to stand still. Maggie looking on as the hand reached out, as the fingers grew ever closer, and as Lyanna seemed to have no place to run. Her mace swung faster and faster. Dead men no match for a mother's fury, as she tried to get to her girl, and watched the hand begin to close. Maggie crying out and cursing the gods for lying to her, for giving her hope only to take it away so cruelly. Then the giant began to fall, the hand soon falling away, and Lyanna's mace joining her own to take down the last of the dead men in her way. "How?" she said to no one, as she looked, only to see Jorah pull his sword from the giant's foot. "This is no time to rest, mother. There are more of them." Lyanna said, her face scowling as she looked at the dead men pouring in the gate. "But let's give them more than a bear's roar," she said, as Jorah and Tormund joined them once more. "Akia!" She swung and caught the 2 dead men that came her way, the weapon she had gotten Gendry to make for her, taking them both down at the same time. Feeling one of them come closer to her than she would like, she unattached the top and used its sharp point to deal with him before reattaching it and spinning once more. A little to her left, Gendry swung his hammer, as if it was as light as needle, which it was, anything but. The dead, though, kept coming. No matter how many she killed or how many Gendry and the others around her killed, they just kept coming. She felt herself growing tired, and saw that Gendry was barely swinging his hammer now. Around them, their own men had begun to fall, and then she felt the knock to her head and stumbled. To her horror, she saw she'd lost it. The weapon had gone, leaving her with a dragon glass dagger and the cat's paw one. Arya, taking both of them in her hands, and stabbing out in every direction. "We need to run," Gendry shouted in Arya and nodded before she saw him fall. "No," she cried out, the sounds of her pain soon reverberating about the keep. Determinedly she moved faster and faster, trying to get to him, only to find that she could not, nor could she see him any longer, and she feared the worst. The greatsword took 3 of them at once, the flaming sword another 3, and she looked on as the Hound and Beric came to Gendry's aid. Arya feeling incredibly relieved when she saw him being helped to his feet. He was hurt, but she didn't know how badly, and all she could think was that he was alive. Unfortunately, despite having Beric and the Hound and now Gendry once more fighting close to her, it didn't do her own situation any good, as the dead kept coming her way. "Adyay," she heard Gendry cry out in warning, and then she was falling to the ground. Every instinct she had was telling her to turn, to get away from the hands that grabbed at her. The dragonglass dagger was buried into a white's neck and was lost to her. The cat's paw lay a few feet ahead of her on the ground. She punched, kicked out, crawled and rolled and picked it back up, just in time, and buried it in the side of a dead woman's head. "Stick him with the pointy end." Jon's words playing out in her head. "Better them than you, little sister. Remember that always." The voices once more, and she felt her will to live and see another day, to laugh with her brother and to kiss her bull once more. The thoughts suddenly giving her strength that she did not know she had. The cat's paw was like a blur, and she finally made it to her feet, looking to see the Hound, Beric, and Gendry all fighting while looking her way. She gave Gendry and the Hound a nod, and then she moved quickly away from the large group of the dead that was in between them both, some, if not most of them, following after her. Yatyr ran, dodging the hands that came her way, stabbing out with the cat's paw where she could, and looking around as the keep looked ready to be overrun. Glancing at the main gates, she swore she saw the flames just outside them, and as she quickly looked up, she saw that Drogon was there. When she heard the sound of the horses, she felt they had a chance, and so she climbed up a wall, ran across some roofs, and then down one of the baileys, before running down some stairs and coming back up behind where the Hound, Beric, and Gendry were. As quick as she could, she ran to them, offering whatever help she could, and stabbing a dead man who was moving behind. The Hound. She saw Beric's flaming sword go down, the man being stabbed repeatedly just as she reached them. Once she did, she looked to the Hound and then to Gendry, and all three of them almost seemed to share the same thought. The Hound nodding to her and Gendry doing likewise, and then they were all fighting together once more. Kano? What magic the Red Witch had used, he didn't know, but she'd lit their lances with it, and they had ridden out and cut through the dead me. Jiao he'd seen fall, but the men he'd lead had lost but a few of their number, and had passed him by as he'd ridden through. Reaching the other side, the archers amongst them quickly lit their arrows and loosed them. Quoting seeing those who'd been with Jiao do the same from the other side, they quickly reformed back up, and soon they were riding once again, this time from east to west. 3 times they'd ridden, and how many dead they'd cut down he couldn't tell, but still, they came. After each charge, the arrows flew, and now while the horses rested, they flew in even larger waves. 1, 2, 3 volleys fired into the mass of dead men, cutting them down along with their charges. He could see it clearly now, why his call had told him to ride through and not engage, to not stop to fight, and most of his men had done as they'd been bid. Any who had not, and the knights in their iron suits, had found there was no protection from the dead men. Those who'd tried to fight were simply torn them from their horses, and the dead had overwhelmed them. While they charged, his Khaleesi wasn't idle. Drogon laying down waves of flame after flame and thinning the numbers down just as they did. He, like others of the Khaleesi, had looked on approvingly, watching as she proved herself to be worthy to lead them. Khaleesi staggered the Khaleesi was either and had explained to those closest to him who'd asked after him as they rested. Their Khaleesi had gone to challenge the Khadle of the dead, he and his dragon gone to face off against the Khaleesi's now dead one. Khaleesi rested that it was their way. The mightiest warrior of them all would challenge the mightiest of their enemies. He'd face their enemy's leader, their champion, the greatest of their warriors, and should the great stallion wish it so, he'd win. Keisha Dothrak? We ride? Fako asked. Keisha Dothrak, he said as they formed up once more. He was about to give the order when he looked to the stone house and saw it was about to fall. Irno calling Fako back and pointing to it. Keisha Dothrak Reke, we ride there, he shouted, pointing to the stone house. His men quickly formed up to ride now in a different direction, and Shuno soon felt the wind blow his braid from side to as his horse gathered speed. Brian! Oathkeeper cut down dead man after dead man, Brienne not tiring, and finding that the dead didn't do so either. More than once she'd grabbed Podrick when a dead man had taken a hold of him. Her squire was fighting well, but against these numbers even she and Jaime struggled. Lord Reed had fallen, as had many others. And yet they'd been reinforced too. The giant men of the mountains had come to their aid when she'd all but given up hope. Their ferocity in attacking had driving the dead men back, or had at least as anything ever did. The dead didn't retreat, she'd found. They cared not for losses and they never backed down. All you could hope for was brief moments of respite, when you deal with those nearest you and the next wave hadn't arrived just yet. Jaime fought like a man possessed beside her, Brienne finding that even despite the nature of the fight she was in, that her eyes wouldn't leave him. Widow's Wail moving just as quick as Oathkeeper, and Brienne wondering where he'd gotten the strength or skill to wield it so. Were this not his offhand, then she'd have not been surprised. As even when she'd beaten him on the road, it was clear he was more skilled than she. Brienne winning only because of circumstance and not because she had outmatched him. Fighting against him in the sparring yard as they practiced, seeing him against others, had shown her that Yome was a much poorer swordsman now than he had been. And yet to see him fight now, you'd not think so. She saw the dead thin out, another brief respite coming their way, and she felt the need to catch her breath, and to take a much-needed drink of water, hoping that she had time for both. Oathkeeper took the head of a particularly ugly dead man, and then there were none close by. Brienne reaching down to her pouch and taking a swallow before insisting that Podrick took a drink too. "Drink?" she said, handing him the pouch. "I'm not thirsty, sire," Podrick replied, and Brienne felt a small amount of pride flare up. She was a knight, and should she fall this day, then she'd fall as such. "Drink, Podrick," she said, and he nodded as he drank down a large swallow of the water at her behest. "Eat this, both of you." Jaime said, handing her a broken block of cheese, which she took a huge bite out of before she handed it Podrick. He'd no sooner swallowed it than they were at them again. Brienne looking to see Jaime, staring at her with a small smile on his face as he raised his sword. "For the king and queen, and for the living," Jaime said loudly. Brienne hearing some cheers go around despite the circumstances they found themselves in. For the king and queen, and for the living, and for my friends," she added. Seeing Podrick look to her and Jaime give her a small nod. They came in a larger wave this time, and she feared that it would be the end. Oathkeeper barely keeping them at bay, and soon enough she'd lost sight of Jaime and Podrick. She felt her despair grow, her sword now moving almost as if it had a will of its own, and Brienne simply going through the motions. It was then she saw the flames and felt the wings of the dragon as it flew over her. Her head turning, and she saw the dead outside the gate were now ablaze. It gave her hope. All was not yet lost, and when she heard the sound of hoofbeats, she began to fight even harder. Aegon. Firing an arrow from a dragon was perhaps something he should have practiced more, his first two not even coming close to hitting Viserion or the Night King. The third had barely missed the latter and bounced harmlessly off the former, but it did have the desired effect. Aegon watching as the Night King grew warier, the dragon glass tips and the weirwood arrows themselves making him ever more cautious. As for him and Rhaegal, Viserion and the Night King had an advantage over them. Being dead allowed for both of them not to worry about their own safety when it came to maneuvering. However, they also had a rather surprisingly big disadvantage too. Just like a raven with an injured wing, they couldn't fly as well as one who had not. The rotting away of the golden dragon had created an issue with flying through the air, and so, where Rhaegal glided and soared, Viserion had to fight the elements far more. It gave him opportunities, and he took as many of them as he could, bathing the Night King with flames when he'd managed to outturn him and outrun him. In front of him, Bran had stopped demanding they go back. His brother, or the thing he'd become, was now sure that was not what was going to happen. Instead, he'd actually tried to help, or at least Aegon believed he had. The flock of ravens he assumed was his brothers and not the Night King's. Not that he had managed to do anything that had helped yet. Dragons flew far faster than ravens, and the chase he'd led the Night King on had outpaced the flock. It did give him even more ideas, though. But as he and they were turning, he realized that he'd made a big mistake. The pained noise that came from Rigag, clear evidence of that it was a lesser scratch than it could have been. Didn't make him feel any better, and he lined up his bow and fired his last arrow far more quickly than he should have, because of it. Had he breathed and taken a moment, then he may have actually been able to hit the Night King, or even Viserion somewhere that could be pierced. Instead, in his worry over his dragon, he'd used the arrow to force them away from Rigagel and to give him time to put some distance between them and him. Nilixisagiri Koba, Rhaegal. Is it bad, Rhaegal? He asked the dragon, and he felt the bond between them grow just a little more, as Rhaegal explained it was just a scratch, and that he could keep fighting. Whether it truly was, or whether his dragon didn't wish to let him down, Aegon cared not. He'd promised Rhaegal they'd fly together, and that he'd not allow him to be hurt, and he had meant it. This needed to end, and end soon. And so the time for the chase was over. Kanir Rahiel Gurugon Nika Kanir. There, Rahiel, take me there, he said, flying closer to the flock of ravens. He felt Viserion and the Night King behind him, could almost sense the Night King feeling even more confident now. His arrows were gone, and he smiled at that as he wanted him confident. Confident men made mistakes, and while the Night King wasn't truly a man, Aegon felt the principle would hold just as true. When he saw the ravens were in sight, he hoped that Bran would play his part, and as he reached down to take Longclaw from its sheath, he heard the sound of Drogon's roar. Looking back over his shoulder, he saw the Night King was doing likewise, and so he told Rhaegal to change direction quickly. The ravens moving even quicker than his dragon did, for once. Exod watched as the Night King looked from him to Dany and to the ravens, almost as if he was trying to decide who was the greatest threat. And then it was like time was frozen. It was as if it simply stood still. Images filled his head of dragons flying in the sky, of men fighting on them, and finally of one which showed him the way. He felt Rhaegal break through the vision of the images, the bond he had with the dragon, quickly pushing everything else away. And for the first time since he'd mounted him again, he and Rhaegal were at odds. Ilgun then hearing a strange, almost otherworldly voice in his head. Gainshir Dagtirotasen Daxir. No, I will not, the voice said. Zia was at Exis new hoso, but Exis said, Mary new hoso. You must, this is the way, this is the only way, he said, and felt it as his dragon reluctantly agreed. Had he been thinking more clearly or about it even in the slightest, then he may have asked himself where it came from. Where did he get the knowledge that he had? How had he the mastery of a language that he had barely known more than a few words to? Had he been thinking of it at all, he may have asked himself that question, but he was not. Instead, his mind focused only on what was to come, and he prepared as Radiel began to climb higher into the sky before the dragon tucked his wings in and began to dive. Aegon could see the Night King beneath him. He seemed to be looking around, trying to see where he had gone, and then he saw the flock of ravens attack him and almost force him from Viserion's back. He saw the flames that came from Drogon almost completely cover Viserion, the Night King, and the ravens, and he felt his brother slump forward in front of him. Knowing now was the time, he pulled Longclaw from its sheath and readied himself. The sword now in his hand, he watched as the distance between Radiel and Viserion closed. 100 feet, 50, 25. The jump was good and true, Longclaw dipping deep into Viserion back and piercing the gap between the scales. Aegon held on for dear life as the dragon was finally at rest, its now truly dead body spinning as it fell from the sky. While he was near the dragon's tail, the Night King was at the other end of Viserion, trying to hang on just as much as he was. The impact when it came dislodged him, throwing him almost 20 feet from the dragon, and the large drift he fell into, while cushioning the worst of the fall, still jarred him some. Aegon climbed out of it and into a snowstorm. Around him nothing but white until he saw the brightest light that he'd ever seen before and moved to it. He stumbled through the snow, falling into the banks more than once, and when he finally made it to the light, he found himself almost standing still, so awed was he by what he saw. Viserion burned, but not from a fire, and there was no heat coming from the dragon's body. Instead, it was the light that seemed to be burning him from the inside out. Aegon quickly moving to the source of that light, and putting both of his hands on Longclaw's hilt, he pulled it out and held it up to the sky. In this, Aegon Targaryen, fulfill your destiny and end this once and for all. A voice called out, Aegon turning to see where it had come from. Show them, Aegon! Show them what we knew all along. You are the song of ice and fire, my son. It's time for your song to be sung, a woman's voice said. You are a dragon. Aegon, be a dragon, another voice called out. It was always you, son. It was always supposed to be you. You are the prince that was promised. It's time to see that promise made good. A man's voice said, Mother, father, he called out, and then he looked as Viserion seemed to almost blow away into dust, as the snows that surrounded him seemed to fade away, and he found himself walking in nothing but green lands. He turned this way and that, and then he saw him, the Night King, rising to his feet, and Aegon seeing there was something different about him. This was not the same cocky and confident thing who had almost laughed at him as he had raised the dead at Hardhome. There was fear in place of that confidence, worry in place of the cockiness, and Aegon moved towards him with the light still shining brightly from Longclaw's blade. And now it ends, he said as he brought the blade down and felt it connect with the ice of the Night King's own. Watching as the ice blade broke into 100 different pieces, as he did the same to another, and as the Night King took a step and then another backward, Aegon saw that fear had grown even more. Longclaw slamming down and smashing through each of the Night King's blades, just as the ice blades the White Walkers wielded had against the normal steel at Hardhome. This time, though, the confused and worried looks were worn on a dead, icy face, and not a warm, living one. Rugen moved ever closer, and finally it seemed as if the ice blades were no more. The Night King looking almost defeated, and Aegon wasting no time to see that it was so, he thrust and thrust deep, and Longclaw did what it had always done for him. It ended those who wished him harm. It protected him from those who wished him dead, and it helped him win the day. The explosion of ice was large. Aegon shielding his eyes and then looking to see there was nothing there in front of him. No remnants of the Night King or the dead dragon, and the light which had shined from Longclaw was now gone, leaving only the silver blade behind. He heard the wings behind him, the sound of the dragons as they landed, and he turned to see them there. Rosier with his brother slumped on his back, and Drogon with Dany climbing down from its own. Here I am king, he said softly, as he moved to his wife. Winterfell 305 AC. Genuidity. He turned and saw her dragged down beneath a large group of whites. Podrick nowhere to be seen, and he the closest one to her, Despite giving everything he had, it was clear he'd not reach her, and more so now that his own time was also close to an end. Widow's Wail was buried in a White's head, and the dragon glass dagger was his only weapon. But there were simply too many of them. As he felt the rotting hands claw at him and thrust out with his dagger, he prepared to be judged by his gods. Then there was nothing. No pressure. No Whites. Yaemai looking on as one by one, they all simply fell to the ground. Had he been thinking straight, he'd have understood what had just occurred. But his mind was focused on his survival, and now on finding Brienne. He pushed through the dead bodies to the pile where he'd seen her fall, and began pulling them off, what he hoped would be a still-living Brienne. The smack he got to his face normally wouldn't have been something that made him laugh like a fool. But on this occasion, that's what he did. Yania reaching down and grabbing the hand that had just struck him and helping Brienne to her feet. She was dazed, confused, and bore more than one scratch on her face. But she was alive, and that was all that, in the end, truly mattered. There were two sides, the living and the dead, and it was far better to be on the side of one than the other. "Podrick?" Brienne asked, and Jaime shook his head. "What happened?" she asked, as she looked around. "The king happened," Jaime said, his smile. Though tinged with a bit of sadness for the lost squire, was far happier that they had won. Together they began to move their way from the parapets and down the stairs, Jaime taking in the sights that were in front of him. People were looking around, both in relief at the knowledge the fight was over, and Jaime thought, in hope that those they cared about survived also. Soon enough he was doing likewise, looking around for familiar faces and trying to see who had and who had not made it through. The Queen's men seemed more or less intact from what he could see. Grey Worm, Jon, the leader of the Dothraki, and one or two faces that he'd seen guard her and the king's chambers were all amongst the living. Brienne was looking over at the small group that was walking through the courtyard. Jaime seeing Arya Stark. The Hound and the Smith, who'd he'd found out was Robert Baratheon's bastard son. Not that anyone would have needed to tell him that, as just looking at the boy, it was clear enough. He saw Brienne both sigh and smile at the same time when she looked, and saw that the Mormains and the crazy wilding had made it through. Jaime, knowing now that the man was someone his king considered one of his truest and most leal friends, as he did the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, who was presently walking down the stairs behind them. "Sir Jaime," a voice called, and Jaime looked to see Ned Dane move through the yard. Dawn on his back and his cousin walking not too far behind him. "Lord Dane," he said with a nod in the man's direction. "What happened?" "How?" Ned asked. "The Night King is dead, truly fucking dead, like the rest of these fuckers. I fucking told you all. Only a fool or a madman would mess with King Crow." Tormund shouted loudly as he reached them and smiled at Brienne. "You truly think he won?" Cyrgreld said almost mockingly, and Jaime found he didn't like his tone one bit. "He won. Had he not, then we'd all be meat just like these fucks here," Tormund said, kicking one of the dead men that lay on the ground. Their group was soon joined by another that included some of the Dothraki, the Queen's men including Ser Jorah, all glad to see each other, while the rest of them looked to try and see those who'd not made it. One of the Dothraki handed him Widow's Wail, and Jaime stood almost in shock as people seemed to look at him for guidance about what to do next, quickly gathering his wits and telling people to gather their own dead and to build pyres to burn those that needed to be burned. "What of the other dead?" Ser Jorah asked. "Gather them up in as many piles as needed. They'll burn once the king and queen and the dragons come back," Jaime said. "Should we not send someone to find them? What if they're hurt?" Ned Dane asked, his voice far more concerned than Jaime was expecting it to be. "My brother is not hurt. He'll be back, he and my good sister," Logia Stark said, leaving no room for doubt. Without dismissing them, people soon just went about the work that needed to be done, and Jaime soon found himself alone again in the middle of the yard. A part of him had thought he'd come here to die, to fight for the living, and to go meet the gods after finally doing the right thing. He'd come here with no real expectation that he'd live if he was being truthful with himself, finding that the further he traveled there really wasn't much he had to live for. Cersei was lost to him, her mind no longer her own, and what she had become was something that scared and horrified him. He'd seen the green flames that still burned where the great sept had once stood, and her smile as she was being crowned while their son lay dead because of her actions. Yapsley had heard her care more about a throne and a crown than the people and been disgusted by her for the first time ever. Yapsley had served a mad king, and he had no intent of serving an equally mad queen. But she was his sister, his love, and so he'd tried one last time, only to fail just as he had so often on so many things. So he'd left to come to the most dangerous place in Westeros, all the while understanding that the chances of returning were slim and none. Life was most strange, he thought, as he began to move around the courtyard. Men coming to him to ask what duties they needed to perform, and Jaime wondering when he'd risen up to be the man they asked. No, that was a lie. He didn't wonder that. On that alone, he was certain of the why and when. He'd come here to face an inevitable death, and had instead found a reason to live. A king and queen to serve, along with a promise to keep that he'd given up all hope of ever seeing true. He'd been given a second chance to be what he always wished to be, and only a fool would turn it down. For Jaime, his days of being a fool and of being the stupidest Lannister were finally done. "Have you seen Sir Brienne?" he asked one of the Northmen. "I think she's up on the parapets, Sir Hammy," the man said, his voice respectful where once it would have been only mocking. He turned and walked towards the stairs, looking on as the bodies of the dead army were dragged unceremoniously across the ground and out of the keep, while their own dead were treated with far more care and deference. When he reached the top of the stairs and looked around, he saw her kneeling, and he knew what it was she was looking at. Jaime moving quickly but quietly to where she was, and then kneeling down beside her. Podrick looked as if he was sleeping, his eyes closed and his face unmarked. Jaime needing to look closer to see the gash in his side that had ended him. He said nothing as he knelt with her, just offered her the comfort of his presence for all the good it would do. Brienne's hand softly moving the boy's hair from his face, and her thumb brushing over the boy's now not-so-chubby cheeks. "He believed in me far more than I ever did myself. I treated him terribly. You know, at first, he was so damn frustrating and annoying," Brienne said softly, almost to herself. "But over time, I came to rely on him to care for him. When I had doubts, he'd assuage them simply and without preamble. He'd just speak and tell me I was on the right track, that I was doing the right thing, and those doubts would go away." Axlani looked as she leaned forward and placed a soft kiss on the boy's forehead before she reached underneath the body and lifted him into her arms. She stood up and carried him down the stairs, and did so in such a gentle way that had you not seen her fight, then you'd think she would not be able to. No one this soft and gentle could wield a sword with the ferocity she did. Your mind would tell you. Jaime followed her to the Godswood, much to his surprise, as he knew that Winterfell had a septbird, had one at least, the last time he'd been here. As they walked through the gates, he saw that others had done as she had, and brought those they cared for to the sacred place the Northerners said their prayers in. She laid him down close to the weirwood tree, Jaime looking to see Mags Mornant and another northern lord, the Glover, he believed, were kneeling in front of it with the body of the Crannogman close by. When Brienne knelt, so did he, and what her prayers were for, he couldn't tell. His own, though, were soon answered as he heard the dragons roar and looked to the sky. The North 305 AC. Dany. Drogon had flown faster than he had ever done before to bring her to Aegon and Reimagined, and when she'd gotten there, she'd felt she'd arrived just in time. Seeing them being chased by the monster on her son's back fueled her anger and worry, and Drogon picked up on both. She'd not even needed to tell her son to let loose his flames. Drogon knew that TARGERIYAN was no longer his brother, and did so without a moment's hesitation. Then it had seemed as if time had simply stopped. The world around her almost seeming to come to a crawl, and Dany not hearing a sound as events played out in front of her. She saw Aegon jump from Rhaegal's back, his sword in his hand, and then it seemed to be in Visceron's back, and the dragon, the monster, and Aegon were all falling to the ground. Dany didn't know what to do, what to think, or how to save the man she loved, and she felt the panic begin to rise in her chest. Her eyes searched the ground for any sign of Aegon, and she soon feared the worst when she didn't see him. Where the light came from, she couldn't tell, but it gave her something to focus on. And she breathed out a huge sigh of relief when she saw Aegon holding the sword in his hand. Drogon flew closer without her bidding, her son eager to help Aegon and to see that Rhaegal was unhurt. Dany smiling when she saw her other son turn in the distance to fly back this way. When she saw the explosion of ice, she told Drogon to land, and as she did so, she looked to see Rhaegal had also decided that the fight was done. She quickly climbed down of Drogon's back and ran to her husband, her arms pulling him to her and holding him tightly as she swore to never let him go. "Don't you ever do that to me again, Aegon Targaryen," she said as she kissed him while checking to make sure he was unharmed. It's done, Dany. He's gone. Yak saw it and she looked over his shoulder, trying to see if there were any remains of the Night King anywhere. Targaryen? She asked. At peace, Aegon said, taking her hand and leading her to a large scorched area where he told her. Targaryen had simply burned away. How? She asked, not understanding. The sword it lit up, Lightbringer, Melisandre called it. When I was at Castle Black, Stannis had a sword that he and she claimed to be the one, but it was a mummery, the flames untrue, mine were not, Aegon said. Did you know? She asked. I saw, as we flew, I saw the battle over the God's Eye, Daemon on Caraxes fighting Aemond on Vogar, Aegon said. You jumped from Rosiegel's back because you had a vision, Gain said annoyedly. We're here because I had a vision, Dany, Aegon replied. I heard them before I fought him, I heard them, Aegon said, looking at her, his hands holding her face so she could see the truth in his eyes. Who? My father, my mother, Uncle Aemon, and Uncle Benjen. I heard them telling me what to do, who I was, and why I was here. Aegon said. You're here because of me, Aegon, because of our babe, she said as he nodded. I am, he said, and then he kissed her before they turned to walk back towards the dragons. Is it done? Aegon, truly the Night King, he's gone and won't return, she asked as they walked. It's done, it's over, we should go back to the others. They'll be worried. Aegon said, and she found herself keen to make sure the rest of the people that she cared about had survived also. When they reached the two dragons, she noticed how Bran was positioned, and so she looked to see if Aegon was worried that his brother was unmoving. She found he was not, almost as if he expected it, or perhaps it was that he just didn't care. When he moved from her, she felt his absence almost immediately, and she looked on as he moved close to Rhaegon and spoke some words to her son before he climbed up the wing and checked on Bran. Is he? She asked, concerned. He's dead, Dany, quote the Raven, nevermore. Aegon said with a chuckle as he took up his position behind the body of what had once been his brother. Dany herself felt nothing for the boy. Aegon had told her that he was no friend of theirs and didn't wish for what they wished for. In truth, he'd gone much further and said that he believed that Bran would actively work against them should the chance arise. So she was happy he was gone and wouldn't get that chance. And yet she felt a bit uncomfortable with how casual Aegon was acting about it. Her husband was not an uncaring man. He'd proved that to her, and she'd seen it with how he was with Arya and with others. However, it seemed there was a line to him. There were those with them and those against them, and woe betide any who found themselves on the wrong side of that line. So despite her discomfort over how he was reacting to Bran's death, she also felt a deep sense of satisfaction in knowing that yet another obstacle, another enemy that wished her ill was no more, that there were more to deal with, should have given her pause, and yet it did not. She was not solitary in this. She was no longer the last of her kind who would need to face the whole world alone. Dany had a husband and would soon enough have a child. Her other children were alive and well, and their family would prevail. She found she needed no more truth than that. Sovegan Drogon, she said after she had settled on her son's back, and almost at once they were in the air.